There is a well-known list of symptoms of vitamin A toxicity: depression, anxiety, lots of cognitive issues, memory loss, chronic fatigue, skin issues, eczema, psoriasis, inflamed skin, dry skin, your eyes just being dry, tinnitus, joint pain, crooked teeth, inflamed esophagus, inflamed lungs, asthma, kidney issues, weight gain, signs of early diabetes, GI issue, Crohn's disease, colitis, muscle fatigue, pressure in the brain.
Is Grant Genereux right about vitamin A toxicity? Is there really a conspiracy to poison you with vitamin A? And what is the actual safe amount of vitamin A that you can eat per day? In this video, we are going to answer these 3 specific questions. Now, this is the 3rd video in a series of videos I've been doing covering this whole low vitamin A trend that we're seeing. So the first video, I talked about the theory itself and some of the logical problems that it has, the rational problems it has. And then the second thing I talked about was what was going on inside the sphere around it, particularly on the Ray Peat forum. Now, I promised in those videos that I was going to talk about or go through Grant's book. And so I have finally gone through Grant's book, and I want to break down his specific arguments. Now, the major arguments that Grant lays out are: 1, that vitamin A is highly toxic; 2, that there isn't deficiency of vitamin A; and at 3, the premise of the book is that there's some conspiracy to poison people with vitamin A. The way that I see it, the way I'm going to run with this is I'm going to break down in this specific video the toxicity. So like, how toxic is vitamin A actually? And I'm going to use Grant's own studies. And then in a subsequent video, I'm going to actually break down the deficiency studies that Grant cites and tries to show that there actually isn't deficiency. So we're going to talk about those. And along this process, we'll see if there's really this grand conspiracy to poison you with vitamin A. Now, with that said, the next video, I'm going to get into the deficiency, and you're going to want to see both of these videos because they will basically destroy the entire foundation of this low vitamin A argument and get us back to some sensible understanding around what's going on with vitamin A. So I would subscribe and hit that notification bell so that when this next video comes out after this one, you can catch it right away. Now let's jump in to this specific argument here about vitamin A toxicity. And I want to open it up and I want to read a quote from Grant's book, Poisoning for Profits. This is from chapter 3, The Incredible Toxicity of Vitamin A, which is on page 27. So let me share this quote here with you, and then we'll jump into the specifics after that, and we'll go from there. So Grant starts out here, and this subsection is titled Head to Toe Tissue Destruction. And what he says is, one of the most important aspects to fully understand and appreciate about vitamin A toxicity is that it affects the entire body. It does not affect just one organ or show up in just one tissue type. No, the scope and breadth of the destruction it will cause is just staggering. It'll slowly destroy everything from the hair on top of your head down to the nails on the ends of your toes. It'll also slowly destroy every other organ and tissue in between. Although vitamin A toxicity will be most aggressively expressed by the destruction of the epithelial cells, it will have profound and devastating cascading effects throughout the rest of the body too. Vitamin A is very capable of destroying every cell in the human body. However, its most devastating effect is upon the body's stem cells. Although most of the visible toxicity destruction takes place in the surface tissues, that of the skin, eyes, hair, and joints, that is just the beginning of its reach. It'll slowly suck the calcium out of the bones and teeth. It'll distort the very shape of the spine and skull. It'll be correspondingly destroying all the internal organs too. This kind of reads like a fiction novel here. And to be fair, like, this is a fiction novel. The TLDR for everybody that's going to go through the rest of the video. While vitamin A toxicity is pretty severe, the idea that people are going to be getting this toxicity from regular consumption of foods, as we'll see throughout the rest of this video, is extremely tenuous. So we can have this, nice preamble from Grant in this chapter talking about how toxic vitamin A is. But when we start to get to the dosages that he cites from the studies, it becomes pretty laughable, especially when you start to see people inside the low vitamin A sphere like Thor Torrens and people like this starting to say, oh, you can't have any carrots or any egg yolks or things like this because vitamin A is just that toxic. It's like, let's actually look at the studies that these guys are resting on to make these determinations and put this information out to people. In Grant's book, he cites 3 major studies to prove his point on vitamin A toxicity. Then he did a podcast with Elwyn Robinson, and he talked about a study in there with pigs. So I'm going to go through those 4 studies. These are Grant's key studies that he discusses. And then what we're going to do as we go through the studies so that it makes sense for you is we're going to actually break down the vitamin A dosages in terms of egg equivalents, liver equivalents, and cod liver oil equivalents. Now, why am I using eggs, liver, and cod liver oil? Because those are the 3 best sources of vitamin A in the diet. There are other sources, but these are some of the 3 major ones, and they're very easy to conceptualize. So what we have here is we have 1 large egg is about 50 grams, and 1 large egg contains about 264 IUs of retinol. Next, we have 1 ounce of beef liver contains about 9,000 IUs of retinol. And then we have 1 tablespoon of cod liver oil contains about 13,500 IUs of retinol. What we're going to do is we're going to see when we go through these studies, how many eggs would you have to eat to get toxicity? How much liver would you have to eat to get toxicity? And how many tablespoons of cod liver oil would you have to take to reach the toxicity discussed in these studies? There is a full document I built out here that I'll be hosting on my website that you can access to see all of my calculations. All the resources will be there. There'll be the full breakdown. After watching this video, if you want to follow along and check my work, please feel free to do so. I invite people to check my work so that we can really come together, come to a true understanding of what's going on with this vitamin A stuff and get some clarity so we can move forward from this particular paradigm. The first study that Grant cites is a study titled The Action of Vitamin K in Hypervitaminosis A. And this is from his book, Poisoning for Profits. And he talks about this study on page 38. And what he says is he says, I like this statement from their abstracts. Rats were fed on massive doses of vitamin A for periods varying from 10 to 18 days. Then in the experimental details section of the report, they define what exactly massive means. It is 1 drop of halibut liver oil per week. Therefore, for these rats, that's a whole 3 or 4 drops of halibut liver oil in their entire lifetime. That was all that was needed to induce serious diseases and bone fracture. Now, this is a problem with a lot of the work done in Grant's book. I don't know if he was intentionally trying to mislead people or if he fundamentally doesn't understand what this means in equivalence to humans with the dosing and the time frames. But this is, well, it sounds like it's, oh, wow, it's a very small amount of halibut liver oil. When we actually break this down in terms of the amounts of vitamin A that the rats are receiving, and we convert that into human equivalent dosages, and then we also look at the time frames, it's like this is actually a really high dose of vitamin A for rats for a really long period of time. Let's actually get to the study and see what the actual researchers had to say and not listen to it through Grant's own perspective, because I think his perspective is a bit tenuous. And so what they say here in the research, they say in a series of experiments, piebald rats were fed on massive doses of vitamin A for a period varying from 10 to 18 days. The source of vitamin A was from halibut liver oil containing 40,000 IUs per gram, which was kindly supplied by Allen and Hannery Limited. Vitamin A was supplied 1 drop of halibut liver oil per rat per week. And they say, whereas groups given excess vitamin A received their fat as halibut liver oil, which was freshly mixed each day with the solid components of the diet. So basically, all we're seeing here is that they gave halibut liver oil, they mixed it in with the food. Now, the other thing we need to see here so we can equivocate this to humans is what was the weights of the rats. The rats used in experiments 1 and 2 had initial body weights of 43 to 85 grams, and the rats used in experiments 3 had body weights of 125 to 150 grams. So we have a weight range for rats between 43 and 153 grams, and this is going to become important because we want to see what is the amount of vitamin A given to these animals based on their weights so that we can equivocate that to humans and get realistic dosages for humans. I'm not going to go through all the calculations. I'm going to spare you, I guess, the specific details of that. But in order to be transparent, I'm going to make this full page with all my calculations and everything available for people to access so they can see what my work was, see my citations and everything like that, be fully transparent about it so that I can go through this without you having to be like, oh, you didn't show his work. It's like, no, my work is right there and we'll run from there. So the first things first is they basically gave these rats 40,000 IUs of vitamin A per week in the form of halibut liver oil. And the rats ranged at the lowest weight, 43 grams, and at the highest weight, 153 grams. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the 40,000 IUs and we're going to see how much that is per kilogram. Now, I've already done the work, and for a rat, that comes out to be about 930,232 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram. Now, we have to convert that into human dosages. And in order to do that, there's a study here that I'm citing, and I'll show you this graphic. We look at a rat and the human equivalent dosage from a rat. To convert a dosage from a rat to a human is to divide the dose by 6.2. So we see that here. And so what we want to do is we want to take that 930,232 IUs per kilogram, divide by 6.2. So for a human, that gives us 150,037 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram of body weight, which for a 90 kilogram human, I'm using that 90 kilogram dose because of my weight, I'm 90 kilograms, would be 13,503,330 IUs per week of vitamin A. So for everybody listening, that doesn't really mean much of anything, right? It just sounds like a really high number. So how many eggs would I need to eat per week to hit the dosage in this study? I would have to eat 51,148 eggs. How much liver would I have to eat per week to hit that dosage? 1,500 ounces of liver. That's right, 1,500 ounces of liver. And then for cod liver oil, I'd have to take 1,000 tablespoons of cod liver oil per week. And the way that I came to that number is I divided that 13 million and change IUs per week by 264 IUs of vitamin A in one egg, roughly 9,000 IUs of vitamin A in 1 ounce of liver, and roughly 13,000 IUs of vitamin A in 1 tablespoon of cod liver oil. We had 51,000 eggs, 1,500 ounces of liver, or 1,000 tablespoons of cod liver oil in order to hit the dosage that they were giving these animals if we were trying to equivocate that to humans. So the dosages here, needless to say, are absolutely absurd. There's one thing I want to point out here to be very fair about this study. This study used halibut liver oil at 40,000 IUs of vitamin A per gram, and then they dosed the rats with 1 drop per week. So 40,000 IUs per week is the dose that I assumed. However, because we don't know how many grams the drop was, and even if it was less than a gram, it's difficult to say if they got 40,000 IUs per week, or maybe they only got 10,000 IUs per week, or maybe they only got 5,000 IUs per week. Even if the drop number was lower, if we had to divide these numbers by a factor of 10, it would still be absurd. So you're still saying if we divide 51,000 eggs per week by 10, we have 5,100 eggs per week. If we divide the ounces of liver by 10, we have 150 ounces of liver per week. And for the cod liver oil, that would be 100 tablespoons of cod liver oil per week. So we still get insane dosages for a variety of these things. Now, that was for the lowest weight rats at 43 grams, which is going to give us more insane values because you have 40,000 IUs for a 40 gram rat. But now let's see what it would be like if we had 40,000 IUs for a 153 gram rat. So a rat that's basically 4 times heavier. I'm not going to go through all the calculations again. You get the idea. But the human equivalent dosage based on the 153 gram rat getting 40,000 IUs of vitamin A per week would be 3,795,030 IUs of vitamin A per week, which for everybody at home is 14,375 eggs per week, 421 ounces of liver, and 281 tablespoons of cod liver oil per week. So again, crazy dosages here that no one is really eating or having on a regular basis. And so to use this study like this to justify vitamin A toxicity is borderline ridiculous in my opinion. There's no way that you're going to say, oh yeah, those 2 eggs you have every morning, it's getting pretty close to that 14,000 threshold for this toxicity stuff. They make the argument for accumulation. There's research figuring out what is the threshold for accumulation. So we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes here in this video. But the doses are absurd in the studies that Grant cites, and they do not support that vitamin A is this super toxic thing. They support that the vitamin A has a high threshold for safety because you can eat such a ridiculous amount of it before you get these crazy toxicity symptoms that we see in the studies. Grant says, oh, in just 10 to 18 days, these rats with a couple drops of halibut liver oil got pretty sick. The rat lifespan and the human lifespan are very different. Humans live significantly longer than rats do. What we see in the research is 2 weeks of a rat's life are equivalent to 1 year of a human life. So these rats were fed these doses of vitamin A, these crazy doses of vitamin A, 40,000 IUs per week for a 43 gram rat versus a 153 gram rat. And they were fed that for 10 to 18 days. That is equivalent for a human being fed between 14,375 eggs and 51,148 eggs. And this is, again, in terms of amount of vitamin A per these eggs for 9 to 18 months. So again, the time frame is absurd. This is more than half a year to 1.5 years of eating these crazy doses of vitamin A. And then you see this sickness. Again, equivocating from the rat dosages. Now, you obviously can't do these studies in humans because it'd be extremely unethical. So we have to rely on some of these factors between the rat dosage and human dosage. But what we're seeing with the vitamin A components here is that the dosages are quite high, and it's actually for a much longer time than Grant implies with his quote here. Therefore, for these rats, that's a whole 3 or 4 drops of halibut liver oil in their entire lifetime. That was all that was needed to induce serious disease and bone fractures. It's like, yes, that's an extremely high dose of vitamin A for rats, Grant, and over a relatively long period of time. And so that's what we're seeing here with this first study. This is actually Grant's best study of the bunch that we're going to go through in terms of supporting his perspective. So let's actually jump into the other studies and see what they show. The next study we see is concerning the toxicity of vitamin A. This is also from Grant's book, Poisoning for Profits. Now, on page 39, Grant says, quite amazingly, where we have a vitamin A toxicity experiment producing the de facto primary vitamin A deficiency condition of xerophthalmia, astonishingly, it does so in just 10 days. A couple things. He cites the quotes from the study, and the quotes from the study don't mention xerophthalmia that he cites. They mention exophthalmos, which is different than xerophthalmia, so that's problem number 1. And then problem number 2 is we'll look at what the dosages are. These are the quotes from Grant's book of Grant quoting the study. So I'm literally using Grant's quotes to disprove his points. And what we see here is Collazo and Rodriguez also fed several 50-gram rats vitamin A concentrate. The rats were fed 0.5 cc daily or a dosage of 20,000 units of vitamin A. The outstanding features of the disease produced in about 10 days were failure to grow, inflammatory changes in the eyes with exophthalmos, not xerophthalmia, which is what Grant mentions, and changes in the bones resulting in spontaneous fractures. Now, before we get into specific dosage, exophthalmos is the bulging of the eyes. Xerophthalmia is the drying of the eyes. They are different things. I don't know if Grant was thinking they were the same thing here because he mentions xerophthalmia, but then he cites this quote that talks about exophthalmos. So I'm not sure what he was trying to get out there. Maybe he was conflating these two things, but they are not the same thing. Now, let's get into the dosages. And before we get in, you can already assume if the previous study gave 40,000 IUs per week, and this study is doing 20,000 IUs of vitamin A per day, well, that would be the equivalent of 140,000 IUs per week, which basically means that the doses are significantly higher. They're on par with almost 4 times higher, 3 to 4 times higher than the previous study. So that's why I'm saying that study was his best chance, and it was still pretty poor. So basically, same type of deal. We have 50-gram rats getting 20,000 IUs per day. So what we want to see is how many IUs per day that is for a human. For me, I'm using a 90 kilogram body weight because that is my weight. If we take the 20,000 IUs for 0.05 kilograms per day and we divide that by 6.2, which as I showed you in the previous section is the human equivalent dose from the research for rats to humans, what we get is 64,516 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram for a human. Now, for a 90 kilogram human, somebody my size, about 190, 200 pounds, what you see is 5,806,451 IUs per day. What does this lead to in terms of these different amounts in eggs, liver, and cod liver oil? That is equivalent to eating 21,994 eggs per day. For liver, that is the equivalent of eating 645 ounces of liver per day in terms of vitamin A intake. And then for cod liver oil, that is the equivalent of eating 430 tablespoons of cod liver oil per day. Not per week. These aren't per week dosages. These are per day. So if you are weighed 190 to 200 pounds, this is how much vitamin A equivalents you would have to eat per day to reach the dosages that we're seeing in these rat studies for toxicity. And again, the rat lifespan is very different from the human lifespan. 2 weeks of a rat's life is equivalent to 1 year of a human life. So we see 10 days for a rat is equivalent to 9 months for a human. So the rats were getting these insane dosages of vitamin A that were on par with 21,000 eggs, 645 ounces of liver, and 430 tablespoons of cod liver oil per day for the equivalent of 9 months for a human. And then they saw toxicity. So is this study really showing that vitamin A is super toxic and that people shouldn't eat it at all and that it's not a vitamin at all because of how toxic it is? Or is it showing us, wow, you can take really high doses of this stuff for like a relatively decent period of time before you get significant levels of toxicity? Now, I'm not condoning that people eat really insane high dosage of vitamin A. All I'm trying to show here is that this individual is talking about vitamin A being super toxic and then citing these insane studies to show toxicity where the dosages wouldn't be met by normal people under normal circumstances. Now, again, we'll talk about what the specific thresholds are. I will give you the specific range that we know from the research is relatively safe. So we'll do that in just a couple minutes. So stay tuned. Now, the next study we see, this one is in humans. So we did rats. We're doing humans here, and then we'll do pigs. This is not a singular study. It's basically a book or a report on vitamin A. And what they say is vitamin A deficiency, health, survival, and vision. Grant cites this in Poisoning for Profits. Now, the specific quotes from the study that Grant cites in his book on page 52 is a newborn child who mistakenly was given 25 milligrams daily or 25 micromoles per kilogram for 11 days died of apparent vitamin A toxicity. So it's like, oh, that doesn't seem like that much, right? Only 25 milligrams. So let's actually break that down and see how much that is in equivalence for a child. And then what we'll do is we'll see that what that equivalent would be for an adult. 25 milligrams is the equivalent of 25,000 micrograms. And we need to get into micrograms so we can convert it into IU to look at the other components, international units. So 1 microgram is equivalent to 3.3 IU. So what we see is 25,000 micrograms is equivalent to 82,500 IUs of vitamin A per day. For a child, this is a newborn child, they would have to eat the equivalent of 312 eggs per day to get that level of vitamin A, 9 ounces of liver per day, or 6 tablespoons of cod liver oil per day for this newborn child. This doesn't seem as much as the other dosages, but again, you have to consider the average newborn is about 3.5 kilograms. So quite small, especially if you're comparing that to somebody my size, 90 kilos, it's significantly smaller overall. And so the dosages are going to be much smaller, not to mention what we see here from the research is that infants are much more susceptible to vitamin A toxicity than adults. So they say from this research paper here, they say evaluation of vitamin A toxicity. This is from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They say infants may show toxicity after low total intakes that are higher on a body weight basis than those required to produce adverse effects in most adults. Normal infants rarely show toxicity from vitamin A intakes as low as 1,500 IU per kilogram per day. There are, however, more reports of toxicity from intakes in the 2,000 to 3,000 IU per kilogram per day range. The child in this unfortunate case study got 82,500 IUs of vitamin A per day as a newborn, with the 50% mark, the average weight being about 3.5 kilograms. So significantly more vitamin A than the set toxicity thresholds that the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition is showing us. So for an adult, what we can do is we can convert that to a weight by weight basis. And as I was mentioning, the CDC classifies the 50% of babies, the average weight of babies is about 3.5 kilos as for a newborn, for male newborns, right? I think females are a little bit smaller. And what you see is 82,500 IUs of vitamin A divided by the 3.5 kilo for a newborn gives us 23,571 IUs per kilogram. For a 90 kilogram adult, this dose would be the equivalent of 2,121,428 IUs of vitamin A per day. which would be the equivalent for me. I would have to eat 8,035 eggs per day, 235 ounces of liver, or take 157 tablespoons of cod liver oil per day to reach this level of toxicity. So again, it may seem a little bit small because it's a baby, it's a newborn baby, but when you equivocate that to adult dosages, it's still massive. He's citing studies showing organisms taking extremely high doses of vitamin A and saying, see, look, it's toxic. And it's like, nobody is eating 8,000 eggs a day. Nobody is having 235 ounces of liver per day. Not even Liver King is eating 235 ounces of liver per day. And the Weston A. Price people are not shoving in 157 tablespoons of cod liver oil per day. They're not reaching these toxicity thresholds. That doesn't mean that lower doses here can't cause problems. But what we're seeing is that the threshold for like extreme toxicity for death is pretty high overall. And again, even the established recommendations, which Grant implies there's a conspiracy of these recommendations to poison you for profits, show significantly lower values than this, like multiple factors lower. And again, we're going to see that in just a few minutes here. Now, the next study, and the last one we're going to go through, is a study that Grant talks about on a podcast with Elwin Robinson, where he's talking about the effects of high-dose vitamin A in pigs. And this study, he talks in the podcast about how terrible the things were that happened to these pigs that absolutely destroyed them.
Destroys these animals, often kills them.
But what we'll see here is the dosages that they gave these pigs were absurd, were absolutely absurd. So let's dive in. This will be the last one we cover, and then we'll start to talk about what are the safe levels of intake. There was 2 experiments done here, feeding pigs a variety of different amounts. The first experiments, what they say, is 30 pigs averaging 8.4 kilos. The weight's important. Keep that in mind. Were allotted 3 per pen and fed one of the following diet treatments: 0 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram of diet, 1,100 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram of diet, 11,000 IUs per kilogram of diet, 110,000 IUs per kilogram of diet, or 1,100,000 IU of vitamin A per kilogram of diet. I have a graphic here from the study that I pulled. And what we see here is that the daily feed consumption for each group. So from the group that got 0 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram of diet, all the way to the group that got 110,000 IUs per kilogram of diet, the pigs ate about a kilo per day. So a kilo of food. So basically they got between 0 and 110,000 IUs of vitamin A per day for 8.4 kilogram pigs. The pigs that were fed 1,100,000 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram of diet per day were only able to eat 0.41 kilograms of the feed per day, which means they didn't get 1,100,000 IUs of vitamin A per day. They got roughly about 450,000, something like this. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So what we see here, they say in the study, toxicity appeared after 14 days when 3 pigs fed the diet containing 1,100,000 IU of added vitamin A per kilogram died. No visible external manifestations of vitamin A toxicity were evident before death. Post-mortem examination revealed massive internal hemorrhages. After 21 days, all remaining pigs on this diet, but none on the other diets, exhibited symptoms of hypervitaminosis A, similar to those previously described for other species. So what are the key takeaways? 1, only the pigs fed 1,100,000 IUs per kilogram of diet suffered symptoms of hypervitaminosis A and death. What does this look like in human equivalent dosages? As I mentioned, the pigs didn't eat the full kilogram of diet, so they didn't get a full 1,100,000 IUs per vitamin A. Because they only ate 0.41 kilograms, they only took in 451,000 of IU of vitamin A per day. These pigs were only 8.4 kilograms. They were only about 18, 20 pounds, somewhere around there. So basically, we have to figure out how much vitamin A these pigs got per kilogram of body weight. And so we're going to divide that 451,000 by 8.4. And basically what we see is 53,690 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram of body weight per day. Now we want to see how much is this for a human. So we have another chart here where you can see we're going to go with the mini pig. In order to figure out how much this is for a human, we're going to take that number and we're going to divide it by 1.1 to get the human dose. So that 53,690 IU per kilogram becomes 48,809 IU of vitamin A per kilogram of human body weight per day, which For me, at 90 kilos, this would be the equivalent of taking in 4,392,857 IUs of vitamin A per day, which in terms of eggs is 16,639 eggs, 488 ounces of liver, and 325 tablespoons of cod liver oil per day in order to recreate the toxicity that we saw for the pigs eating 1,100,000 IUs of vitamin A per day, which again is insane doses, a massive dose of vitamin A that normal people will not be hitting to get toxicity. And again, the animals that were eating 110,000 IUs of vitamin A per day did not get toxicity. Now, I didn't break down that into human equivalent dosage because there's this experiment number 2 where we see another dosage that can give us some more information. So in experiment number 2, they say 24 pigs averaging 4 kilograms were allotted to individual pens and fed on one of the following diet treatments: 0, 220,000, 440,000, 660,000, or 880,000 IUs of vitamin A per kilogram of diet, or 2,063 milligrams of beta carotene per kilogram of diet. We're not going to talk about beta carotene in this video. We will talk about that in future videos. Pigs were observed daily for symptoms of hypervitaminosis A as long as 8 weeks on trial. So pigs on diets containing 880,000, 660,000, or 440,000 of IU of added vitamin A per kilogram of diet developed symptoms of vitamin A toxicity in an average of 17.5, 32, and 43 days respectively. At 8 weeks, apparent toxicity symptoms had not appeared in pigs receiving 220,000 IU of added vitamin A per kilogram of diet. So basically, all the pigs that ate more than 220,000 IU per kilogram of diet of vitamin A got sick, whereas the 220,000 IU per kilogram of diet pigs did not. So I'm not even going to look at the other doses, the 660, the 880, or the 440,000 IUs per kilogram of diet. Let's just look at the 220,000 IUs per kilogram of diet where they didn't get toxicity and see what the equivalent doses of that would be for humans. Okay, there's a problem with this study. With this study, we don't know how much food the 4.60 smaller pigs ate per day, right? And the dosage of vitamin A that was told to us was 220,000 IUs per kilogram of diet. And since we don't know how many kilos of diet they ate, we don't know how much vitamin A they ate, but we can kind of figure it out based on what the other pigs ate. So the other pigs were 8.4 kilograms and they ate on average about a kilo of food per day. And so what we could say is these pigs, the pigs that are 4.6 kilograms, are about 55% of the size of the 8.4 kilogram pigs. So we can assume, probably not perfectly, but we can comfortably assume to some extent that these smaller pigs that were 55% of the size of the larger pigs ate 55% of the food, which gives us about 0.5 kilograms of food per day on average. So this means that these pigs ate about 110,000 IUs per kilogram of diet per day. And since these pigs are 4.6 kilograms, they were eating about 110,000 IUs per kilogram of body weight per day, which when we divide that by 4.6, we get 23,913 IUs per kilogram of pig. We divide that by 1.1, which is the human equivalent dosage. And we see that for a human, this would be the equivalent of 21,739 IUs per kilogram of body weight per day. What does this mean in terms of liver, eggs, and cod liver oil per day? For a 90 kilogram person, somebody my weight, we would be seeing 7,411 eggs per day, 217 ounces of liver, and 144 tablespoons of cod liver oil. So in human equivalent dosages, these dosages did not cause toxicity in the pigs within the time frame of the study, whereas the higher dosages did. And again, even these dosages are super high. They are ridiculously high overall. So these 4 studies that Grant discusses and cites to show just how toxic vitamin A is used in absurd dosages that people would not be able to recreate with regular foods. If anything, we're seeing the safety threshold for vitamin A toxicity here. We're not seeing that it's so toxic that you can't even eat 1 carrot, or if you eat 2 eggs a day, you're just going to become vitamin A toxic. What we're seeing is, wow, these animals are eating absurd levels of vitamin A. And at some of these absurd levels, they're not dying of toxicity or getting obviously sick in the studies that Grant himself cites. I'm using his studies. I didn't even use other studies that are more recent that show the safety threshold. I'm using the studies that he is trying to cite to show this toxicity, and they are proving him wrong. So I don't know, like next time somebody says, oh, you just have to read the book, it's like, don't read the book. It's not worth it. Because when you look at the information in the book, like we're going through the specific studies he's citing, and they're not supporting his points. So it's like, for me, I was like disappointed when I went through the book, because I'm like, I'm really looking forward to this high level argumentation with really supported studies so I can learn something new. And all I learned was this individual is not reading the studies or doesn't understand the studies that he's reading, and then writing a book about it and creating this fear-mongering response about vitamin A. What are actually the safe dosages for vitamin A for humans that have been set by the regulatory bodies? So basically, are they poisoning us for their own profits, as the title of the book suggests? Well, spoiler alert, no, they're not. It's like, and it's very clear, especially when we compare these other dosages. So I have a couple studies to go through. To be fair, I'm going to cite studies and use studies that Grant also uses. So this first study, they say acute toxicity, which occurs when adults and children ingest greater than 100 times and greater than 20 times the RDA respectively for vitamin A over a period of hours or a few days, is less of a problem than is chronic toxicity from preformed vitamin A. Again, beta carotene, retinol palmitate, they're very different. So we're not worrying about beta carotene, has very different effects. We're worrying just about these. When they say is chronic toxicity results from the ingestion of high amounts of preformed vitamin A for months or years. Daily intakes of greater than 25,000 IU for greater than 6 years and 100,000 IU for greater than 6 months are considered toxic, but there is wide inter-individual variability for the lowest intake required to elicit toxicity. Children are particularly sensitive to vitamin A, with daily intakes of 1,500 IU per kilogram body weight reportedly leading to toxicity. So we already talked about children having a lower toxicity threshold, quite lower than adults. And they're saying here, the recommendations say not to do more than 25,000 IUs of vitamin A per day for greater than 6 years. Like, we don't think that's a good idea. That can cause toxicity. What were the dosage used in Grant's study? As an example, from the pig study, the human equivalent dosage for somebody my size was 4,392,857 IUs of vitamin A per day. That was in the millions, not in the tens of thousands, in the millions. For the dosage that didn't cause toxicity for the pigs, it was 1,956,521 IU per day. Are we seeing the regulating bodies here saying, hey, take 1 million IUs of vitamin A per day for multiple months on end? Are they telling us to poison ourselves? No, they're saying less than 25,000 IU, which is multifold lower than the million IU dosages, multi-million IU dosages we're seeing in the studies that Grant cites. And they're also saying this 25,000 IU threshold is for a 6-year time frame. So they are considering the cumulative effect of vitamin A, right? So I'm not seeing this poisoning for profits play out here. I'm seeing a straw man argument erected by Grant Genereux. Now, the next thing they say is, nevertheless, an intake of 25,000 IU per day is nutritionally excessive and carries some risk of toxicity. Similarly, the available scientific data do not permit identification of the upper limit of the intake range that be considered safe. An intake of 10,000 IU per day is more than adequate to avoid toxicity in most people. The effects of vitamin A at intakes between these approximate boundaries cannot be anticipated. So basically they're saying, look, 25,000 is where we see toxicity. Again, that was over the 6-year time frame, 25,000 IU per day. We actually recommend 10,000 IU per day. And we don't know what happens between 10,000 and 25,000 IU, but 10,000 is more than enough for most people's needs on average. That's what they're saying. So again, how many times lower is 10,000 than tens of millions in dosages? It's a massive difference. It's a massive difference. So to sit here and be like poisoning for profits, and then you have regulatory bodies saying this dosage, and then you're citing dosages that would be equivalent to the millions on months and year timeframes, equivalencies for humans, is absurd. It's a strongman argument. It's not a legitimate argument to say something like this. Clinical case studies reviewed provide substantial support for the conclusion that exposure to high doses of vitamin A, 100,000 IUs per day for relatively short periods, days or a few weeks, or lower dosages, which would be 25,000 to 50,000 IU per day for periods of several months or more, can produce multiple adverse effects. Most of the evidence for toxicity at the lower end of this dose, i.e. 25,000 IUs per day, comes from reports of individuals who have had concomitant hepatic damage from other non-contributing factors such as alcohol abuse, severe protein energy malnutrition, or viral hepatitis. Where they're seeing toxicity at the 25,000 IU per day is people who are either drinking large volumes of alcohol, are not eating enough protein, so they're probably in starvation, or they have viral hepatitis like hepatitis C, hepatitis B, etc., which damages the liver, and the liver is the main storage site of vitamin A. At the 25,000 IU, most people who are getting toxicity are people who are already quite sick. Not normal people, it's mostly people who are already quite sick. And even then they're saying, look, 10,000 is the safe dose. Like 10,000 is the upper limit that we recommend. And this guy is sitting over here saying, look, vitamin A is super toxic at millions of IUs per day. So it's an absurd argument. Now, this next paper comes directly from Grant. It's not even really a paper. It's from the Liver Tox website for PubMed, and it's the clinical and research information on drug-induced liver injury from the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease. So Grant cites them, and they actually give us higher dosages than what the traditional regulating bodies are giving us. What they say is chronic hypervitaminosis A usually arises 3 months to many years after starting moderately high levels of vitamin A, generally 10 times the RDA. Normal doses of vitamin A are not associated with liver injury or liver test abnormalities like ALT, AST, GGT, bilirubin, etc. But higher doses, generally more than 40,000 IUs per day, which is about 12,000 micrograms, can be toxic. Acute toxicity is caused by a single or few repeated very high doses, generally greater than 100 times the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, arising within a few days to weeks. So you'd have to take 100 times what is recommended to see acute toxicity, and you have to be many times, 10 times the RDA to see chronic toxicity, and they're setting a threshold here at 40,000 IU, whereas the regulatory bodies are setting it at 10,000 IU. Where is this poisoning for profits? I'm not seeing the conspiracy here where they're trying to kill you with vitamin A. If anything, I'm seeing a straw man argument with poorly cited studies of animals taking ridiculous dosages and then getting sick that could never be recreated in humans unless you're taking specific supplements of vitamin A. And even in those supplements, you'd have to be taking very high dosages. Grant's own studies don't even support his perspective. I wonder if he read the specific studies and then analyzed them in his context, or did he just come to the perspective that vitamin A was toxic for some reason because he switched his diet around to mostly beans, beef, and rice or something like this. Like, oh, look, there's less vitamin A and I feel better, so vitamin A must be a toxin, and then tried to backwardsly rationalize all the studies. I'm not saying he did that, but I wonder, because when you look at the studies, it's not really supported. How much do you actually eat, right? That's the question everybody wants to know. Because we have all this fear mongering from Grant with that initial quote. It's going to kill you. It's going to destroy every cell in your body from your head to your toes.
Tinnitus, joint pain, crooked teeth, inflamed esophagus, inflamed lungs, asthma, kidney issues, weight gain, diabetes, GI issues, Crohn's disease, colitis.
It's like, okay, well, what is a reasonable dosage of vitamin A? And we'll talk about deficiency in the next video. This one's already much longer than I wanted it to be, but I think it's important that we actually do this thoroughly. But how much vitamin A do you need to eat, or what is a safe level of vitamin A based on the guidelines from the regulatory bodies and from the research? The recommended daily allowance I'm sharing here is between 400 and 900 micrograms per day. Now, the difference from micrograms to IU is a dose multiplying it by 3.3. So this is the 400 times 3 is like roughly 12 to 1300 IUs per day for a baby. That's not per kilogram of body weight. That's for in total. And then for an adult, 900 times the 3.3 roughly works out to be about 3,000 IUs per day as the minimum recommended dose. And then we can look over here and we look at the tolerable upper intakes. And again, this is coming from the studies. I just read you some of the studies that are supporting this and giving us information on this. And we're seeing for children from birth, we do not want them to go over 600 micrograms per day, which is the equivalent of about 2,000 IUs per day. And for adults, we don't want them to go over 3,000 micrograms per day, which is roughly 10,000 IUs per day. So there we see that 10,000 mark. We don't want to go over that, but we don't want to go less than for the adults, what we were saying here, the 900, so about 2,000 IUs per day. So I broke these out into ranges just so everybody's clear here. The specific take-home message here, how much vitamin A is reasonable to avoid toxicity, even considering accumulation over years. For children 1 to 3 years old, roughly 990 IUs to 2,000 IUs per day. For children 4 to 8 years old, between 1,300 IU to 3,000 IU per day. For children 9 to 13 years old, we see 2,000 IU to 5,600 IU per day. For 14 to 18-year-olds, we see about 3,000 IU to 9,200 IU per day. And then for people who are greater than the age of 18, 19 plus, 3,000 IU per day to 10,000 IU per day. So those are the ranges. We don't want to go lower than those bottom numbers, but we don't really want to go higher than those top numbers so that we don't get toxicity, but we also don't get deficiency. And in the next video, I will be breaking down Grant's arguments against deficiency. So stay tuned for that. It's going to come out directly after this one so we can put this vitamin A stuff to rest. And again, all of this will be linked on my website so that you can see all the work that I did. You can go through the numbers. The studies are there. The graphics are there. Everything will be present for you. And now, if you are interested in setting up a diet specific to you with these factors incorporated, without the dogma, without the fear mongering, and with some sound, detailed, and practical guidance, you can check out the Nutrition Blueprint, which is on my website, that goes to the new course that I'm building that walks you through ranges like this in terms of vitamin A, other nutrients, and then also protein, carbs, fat, the macronutrients. There's a PDF and a video course there. Stay tuned for my next video where I will break down the deficiency studies from Grant, and we will put this vitamin A stuff, this low vitamin A stuff to rest. And perhaps as a spoiler, I will let you know that I may be tackling some of the components that Dr. Garrett Smith also talks about. So we can also put that stuff to rest as well. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think about it in the comments.